The sound that rolled across Patong Beach that morning didn't match anything the locals were used to. It wasn't the crash of ordinary surf or the rumble of distant thunder. It was deeper, almost like a freight train buried beneath the sand, growing louder every second. The sky was clear, the water calm, and tourists were scattered along the shoreline, some wading in the shallows, others laying out towels for another warm December day. A few fishing boats bobbed offshore, their crews pointing toward the horizon where something unusual was happening to the sea. The tide was pulling back fast, much faster than anyone could remember. The water peeled away from the beach, sucking sand and shells with it, revealing rocks and seabed that normally stayed hidden. Children ran toward the retreating water to collect the stranded fish that now flapped helplessly. Adults stood confused, watching the ocean behave in a way that felt wrong, but without understanding the danger. The region had no tsunami warning system, no sirens, no evacuation instructions, only silence as the water disappeared. 23-year-old RJ had been walking the beachfront with two friends, talking about where they'd eat lunch, when he noticed the way the boats offshore tilted awkwardly. Before he could ask about it, the water far in the distance seemed to rise up like a wall, straight, impossibly tall, and moving. Others saw it too. The first warnings came from tourists who had lived through smaller tsunamis in their home countries. They shouted to run. Some sprinted immediately. Others looked around, unsure whether the threat was real. By the time the noise reached the beach, confusion turned to panic. The wave crashed forward, lifting boats out of the water and throwing them toward the shore like they weighed nothing. People on the beach screamed and scattered. Vendors dropped their carts and fled. The first row of beach umbrellas vanished as the water hit with a force no one could outrun on flat sand. The wave struck RJ before he could reach higher ground. A wall of brown water slammed into him, knocking his legs out from under him and sending him tumbling backward. He hit a parked motorcycle hard enough to knock the breath out of him. Cold water closed over his head, spinning him through broken glass, torn fabric, roofing pieces, and tangled fishing nets. He tried to swim upward, but had no idea which way was up. When he finally surfaced, he gasped so violently that salt water poured into his lungs. The current dragged him toward the street behind the beach, pulling him through storefronts that collapsed as the wave swept inland. Chairs, tables, refrigerators, and entire display racks churned in the water around him. Something sharp sliced across his shin. A wooden beam slammed into his ribs. Every second felt like a struggle against being pinned beneath something heavy or pulled under by the suction of retreating debris. He reached for anything that floated. Coolers, plastic tubs, chunks of broken doors, but the current ripped each object out of his hands. The water pushed him sideways toward a section of collapsed fencing, and for a moment he was pinned against it, unable to free his leg. When the pressure shifted, he managed to pull himself loose before the next surge dragged him farther inland. He didn't know it then, but the first wave was only the beginning. As the water churned past a line of struggling survivors, RJ spotted a single tall palm tree still standing near what used to be a walkway. Everything around it was destroyed. Shops flattened, electrical poles snapped, cars half submerged. But the palm tree, rooted in a thicker patch of sand, had survived the first hit. The trunk swayed violently, its fronds whipping in the wind, but it hadn't fallen. Instinct told him that if he didn't reach it, he would be swept beyond rescue. He kicked through muddy water toward the tree, dodging sharp debris that scraped his arms and legs. The current pulled him sideways, forcing him to angle his body like he was swimming against a river. When he finally reached the base, he threw both arms around the trunk. The bark was rough and jagged, scraping his skin raw, but he held on with everything he had. The water hit again, harder than before. His legs lifted off the sand as the current whipped around the tree. He tightened his grip, locking his right leg around the trunk so tightly that the bark cut into his calf. His muscles trembled from the strain. Huge pieces of debris slammed into the tree, chunks of roofing, sections of wall, even a motorcycle. Each impact shook the trunk and nearly ripped him free. He buried his face against the bark to avoid being blinded by mud and salt water. The roar was deafening. His ears rang as the wave pulled at him, trying desperately to tear him loose. Every inch of his body hurt. He felt his grip weaken more than once, especially when the current twisted him sideways, bending his shoulder back until he thought it would snap. He didn't know how long he held on. Minutes felt like hours. The water level rose and fell in chaotic bursts, each surge carrying debris that could crush him if it hit at the wrong angle. Somewhere nearby, he heard voices screaming, then fading into the roar. At one point, a man drifted past, calling for help before the current dragged him away. RJ couldn't turn to look without risking his grip. When the wave finally began to recede, the force eased enough for him to breathe properly. He lifted his head, coughing violently. The landscape that emerged looked nothing like the beach he had walked that morning. Buildings were gone. Cars were flipped or wedged into trees. Pools of water glistened where streets used to be. Fires burned in places where wires had sparked. People wandered through the wreckage in shock. He kept his arms around the palm tree, terrified to let go in case another surge came. Moments later, a second wave struck, smaller but still strong enough to drag debris across the ruined beach. He climbed higher on the trunk, gripping with his arms and thighs, riding out the surge as it passed. When it receded again, the silence that followed felt even more unreal than the chaos. Eventually, he felt hands on his arms, locals wading through waist-deep water to reach him. They pried his grip from the trunk and half-carried him to drier ground. His legs collapsed beneath him. He had deep cuts across his back, swelling along his ribs, and raw patches of skin where the bark had torn layers away. But he could speak. He could breathe. He was alive. In the hours that followed, he helped however he could, handing people bottles of water, clearing debris for rescuers, and searching for anyone who might still be trapped. The pain came later, when the adrenaline drained and the devastation settled into his memory. Nearly 230,000 people across Southeast Asia died from the tsunami that day. Entire families vanished. Entire towns disappeared. Survivors carried both gratitude and grief in equal measure. In the weeks after, RJ returned to the beach and found the palm tree still standing, scarred, leaning, but rooted. He traced the cuts in the bark where his arms had wrapped around it and realized how close he had come to being washed away. He didn't think of himself as especially lucky. He thought of the thousands who never found anything strong enough to hold on to. The palm tree remains on the shoreline today, a quiet reminder of the day the ocean rose without mercy and the moment when one man's survival came down to the strength of a single trunk in a sea of destruction. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.